always just a giant surge of power that allows him to just bypass whatever plot obstacle stands in his way. And it's this lack of storytelling that leads to one of the most anticlimactic moments in Bleach.
Pero esto no se acaba con Zog, ¿eh? Hay que llegar al 70% de la barra. Hay que llegar al puto 70% de la barra. Huevo, huevo, huevo. Ya 1200 subs, ya somos 1100.
But first, I want to mention that the sales data does not agree with me on a lot of this stuff. The Arrancar arc was actually when Bleach's sales were at their highest, and anecdotally, a lot of people love it, and if you're one of them, I'm not trying to say it's bad, just to me that this is when you can start to see the weaker storytelling aspects of Bleach really come to the forefront. And hell, even I'll say it gets a lot better in its second half, the battle over Kakaroon Town. And the reason for that is we start paying off a lot of those relationships we established in Soul Society. Seeing Tosen finally get his sight back and tell Komamoru, "You're even uglier than I imagined," is such a painful, sad moment for these characters.
Ñ viva SO6.
Viva So6.
But it's emotion like that that makes the battle with Aizen meaningful, and Aizen comes across as a genuinely terrifying villain, a cold, calculating genius who's manipulated this entire situation from the very beginning. There's some really fun revelations and a genuine feeling of hopelessness as Aizen approaches a godlike state, as each of the remaining heroes hurl themselves against him, only to be effortlessly crushed. And so, when it finally comes down to Ichigo versus Aizen, it feels desperate and tense, and exactly how a final showdown should. This is the anticlimactic moment I was talking about. At this point, we've watched Ichigo overcome his fear of death and protecting someone he loves over and over and over. We've watched him save people, we've watched him overturn corrupt systems, and with those motives exhausted, the character starts to feel a little lost. And so in the final battle with Aizen, it doesn't really feel like there's much of his story left to tell, and because of that, the encounter with Aizen doesn't really feel personal or meaningful to either character. And I think that's a huge problem, because for a final showdown like this, concluding nearly 10 years of storytelling, there has to be some emotional weight to it. It has to say something about its characters that's more nuanced than just good versus evil. For example, let's talk about Yusuke versus Toguro from Yu Yu Hakusho's Dark Tournament Saga. At the heart of this fight isn't a question of good versus evil, but whether it's better to live a life of simple mediocrity surrounded by the people you love, or to throw everything else away in pursuit of a single-minded ambition. And it's because of that question that this fight still haunts me a decade and a half later after I first watched it. And especially considering the 80-hour weeks I've had to put into this video. Haha, just a little meta humor there for you folks. It's that storytelling I just don't get from Ichigo and Aizen, especially when the solutions of the conflict is so brief and insubstantial. Ichigo's dad appearing in the final hour, offering to teach him a brand new technique, and after a brief training sequence, Ichigo is powered up so much that this reality warping god, can't even touch him. Ichigo blows Aizen away in a giant surge of power, and that's it. And in that instance, all the storytelling potential we'd been building since the beginning of Soul Society, it all just disappears, and it is so profoundly disappointing. I can remember reading this when it first came out, and that being the moment I first lost faith in Bleach, and on my reread, that has not changed. My own disappointment aside, this moment heralds much bigger problems for Bleach, as it's here where those two other tiny issues I had with Soul Society have grown to the point that they will now have disastrous effects on the series. Because Ichigo is such a reactionary character who only responds to external events as opposed to pursuing his own ambition, there is now nothing to push the character forward, meaning something external now has to happen him in order for the story to continue. And that leads to the second problem, Bleach's world building. Kubo tends to write in a way that means we're only given as much information about Bleach's world as is immediately relevant to the plot. But compare that to something like One Piece. I don't think it's any coincidence that one of the longest running and most successful shonen series also has some of the strongest, deepest world building, where villains, characters, places, and concepts are introduced sometimes hundreds of chapters before they become a major part of the story. But what that means is once the story arc ends, Oda has a near infinite number of directions he can take the next story arc without losing any narrative momentum, because he's already given us the context and information to understand why we should be invested in the next part of the story. Bleach does not work like this. With Aizen's defeat concluding every major story point and character arc, it means a few tiny unanswered plot threads aside, there is now nothing strong enough to pull us into the next major part of the story. And so Kubo now has to invent a new reason for Bleach to exist, and the result is the Fullbringer arc. One part of the fight with Aizen I enjoy but haven't mentioned is how Ichigo loses his power in that final attack. It's a big sacrifice for Ichigo, cutting him off from the world of the Soul Reapers and bringing his character back to just being the regular teenager we met at the beginning of the series. And that's kind of powerful after everything we've been through, especially with him now having to say goodbye to Rukia. But the reason I don't mention it till now is because the central premise of the Fullbringer arc is to undo all of that, with new character Ginjo claiming to have a way to restore Ichigo's power. And so Ichigo joins the Fullbringers, a brand new cast of characters with a brand new villain and even brand new Fullbringer combat system. The art of summoning souls out of inanimate objects to manifest weapons and special abilities, which does lead to Ichigo fighting with a giant swastika for a bit, but you know, that has different cultural connotations in Japan than it does in other places, so we're just gonna move right past that. In fairness, the new combat system does feel like Kubo's attempt to revamp the repetitive battles of Bleach, and there are some really cool ideas here, like Tsukishima's sword, which implants him in your past so that he becomes the most important person in your life, creating some great drama as he turns all of Ichigo's friends against him, and his fight with Byakuya is genuinely the kind of tactical mind game fueled encounter that I wish Bleach had more of. Honestly, I have a lot of sympathy for Kubo here. There is no manual that can tell you how to keep a weekly manga series relevant for 10 plus years, and I respect the chances he took in this arc attempting to do that. The only problem is that I don't think those chances pay off. Once again, it's very difficult to get invested in the Fullbringers given how little character development they get and how disconnected they feel from the rest of Bleach's world. And about halfway through the arc, Ichigo gets his powers back and we drop all semblance of the new Fullbringer combat system, making it just feel kind of pointless, and that is a criticism I would level at this arc as a whole. As once Ichigo's powers are restored, the story just meanders on, the Fullbringers being revealed as the villains, the Soul Reapers returning to defeat them, Ichigo beating arc villain Ginjo with yet another giant surge of power. And at the end of it all, there's just a feeling that...
Casi 75.000 bits donados llevo, jajaja, una locura.
Y como debe ser, Saúl, apoyando el extensible. Gracias, bro.
Nothing really happens. The world and story of Bleach haven't progressed in any meaningful way except undoing the one aspect of the battle with Aizen that gave it meaning. And I don't think the problem here is as simple as one bad storyline, but how the long-term problems of Bleach have left both the story and our protagonist with no meaningful direction, resulting in an arc that feels at best like canonical filler, and at worst like a giant waste of time. I don't think it's any coincidence that this was the point in the series where Bleach's volume sales started to fall, but it's also after the Fullbringer arc that the Bleach anime ceased production and it was pulled off the air. And this is really strange for multiple reasons, namely because Bleach still had an entire...
Es gracioso porque el arco de los Fullbringer es un arco que todo el mundo piensa que es relleno, pero no es relleno. Es tan malo que hace a la gente pensar que es relleno, pero no es relleno.
story arc left to go, but more bizarrely, the The Bleach anime DVD sold crazy well, like better than Naruto, better than One Piece well. And that's likely due to how strong the anime's production was, so why was it cancelled? Was it cancelled? This has been a subject of speculation for quite a while now, and so let's talk about it in a little intermission I like to call, Was the Bleach anime actually cancelled? I'd say the thing to know about the DVD sales is they only amount to a fraction of Bleach's overall audience, with 500,000 lifetime sales. Now if you factor that into Bleach's total unit sales, i.e. the tankobon, DVD sales make up just 0.04% of that. And so it's not really a helpful metric in understanding why the anime was taken off the air. To answer that question, we'd have to do something super awkward and boring, like dig into Bleach's Japanese TV ratings, which we're about to do. This is how Bleach's TV ratings charted over time, but two things to note. One, the 4 different colors represent 4 different time slots, and so aren't directly comparable to each other. And two, due to the massive amount of filler content in the Bleach anime, this shouldn't be taken as a reflection on Bleach's core story. But what's interesting is that the Fullbringer arc, which is here, on average performs worse than the majority of Bleach's filler arcs, struggling to stay above 2% audience share, which is a massive decline when it used to average between 4 and 5% at a similar time slot. And so Bleach was taken off the air and replaced by the Rock Lee and Pals Naruto spin-off, despite still having an entire arc to go.
Reemplazaron el anime de Bleach con el anime del pequeño Rock Lee. Hijo de puta, vos.
And incidentally, the DVD sales show that similar decline. So, was the Bleach anime cancelled due to consistently declining ratings? We can now answer that question with an absolute, definitive, yeah, probably. But that is us inferring information from statistical data and not confirmation from an official source. And so if new information arises, I'll be happy to correct that. The Fullbringer arc had a disastrous effect on Bleach, both in its sales and its TV ratings, and because it didn't advance the overall narrative of Bleach in any meaningful way, Kubo now enters the final arc of Bleach facing the exact same problem. He needs to restart the entire series with a brand new storyline. And you know what? This time, he kinda fucking kills it. The 1000-Year Blood War arc begins with Soul Society being invaded by a secret army of Quincy, a race of people thought to have been wiped out in a violent war with the Soul Reapers a millennia ago. And it's great. The Quincy's already have a place in Bleach's universe because of Uryu, and watching them decimate Soul Society with technology that disables Bankai, meaning our heroes can no longer rely on the power that's protected in this entire story, it is devastating and shocking, especially when the Quincy's leader Yacht, their psychotic and terrifying king, kills Captain Yamato, the leader of the Soul Society and the strongest, oldest Soul Reaper. And it's such a fantastic way of turning Bleach's world on its head, so much so that Bleach actually saw a huge surge in sales at this point. But unfortunately, it wouldn't last. The 1000-Year Blood War is interesting, easily better than the Fullbringer arc, with some really fun villains, some cool long-term payoffs like Nemu finally getting her moment to shine, some great fights like Kenpachi versus Gremmy. In fact, there's just a lot of Kenpachi, which I appreciate. But as great as the start of this arc is, eventually the long-term problems begin to set in, one of the main ones being Ichigo himself. The conflict with Yacht and Soul Society is great, it's super compelling, but it creates this problem where Ichigo, our protagonist, begins to feel like a side character in that conflict. Initially, he doesn't have any more motive to...
Yo lo repito, y no entiendo esa gente que no comenzó viendo Bleach y todos los animes clásicos, vos. Yo no entiendo esa gente que comenzó viendo animes como Sonovisque Doll y todo. Vos tenés que empezar por Bleach. Vos tenés que picar piedra como todos nosotros. Se empieza picando piedra. Se empieza viendo One Piece, Naruto, picando piedrita ahí, ta. Empezá con lo duro, picando piedrita. Con los 500 capítulos. Ahí uno pone una pa. La sociedad de almas, siempre. Pim, 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 pim. Picando piedrita. Acá se empieza picando piedrita. Nada de no, arranco con un anime de 24 capítulos.
Bleach tiene mucho estilo.
Obvio, arranco con un anime de 24 capítulos. No. Vos arrancás con Bleach, picando piedrita ahí, como todos nosotros. Los arcos primero, después te va la sociedad de almas, todo. Ah, pero tiene mucho relleno, te lo ves igual, picando piedrita como todos nosotros. Ahí. Y después te pones así, mirá. Después de picar piedrita, podés disfrutar del Opening 2, ahí. Dale, picando piedrita. Acá se viene, al stream se viene picando piedrita. Se viene picando piedrita. No puedes entrar al stream si no viste Bleach, o One Piece, o Naruto. Uno de los tres tuviste que haberlo visto. Si no, lo siento. Te ignoramos por no picar piedrita. Yo me lo vi, pero lo dropié. Cuenta, pero lo viste. Lo viste. O Dragon Ball. También aceptamos Dragon Ball. También Dragon Ball. Aceptamos Dragon Ball. Picando piedrita, así como debe ser. Como debe ser. Picando piedrita. Picando piedrita, ahí. Yo la verdad, yo me vi los tres grandes del shonen. Bueno, los que fueron los tres grandes del shonen en su época. Y no me arrepiento, vos. Porque creo que en su momento me divertí mucho con los tres, vos. Es como que los valorás mucho, ¿entendés? Picando piedrita.
Stop Yacht than any other member of Soul Society, meaning Ichigo and Yacht's inevitable showdown could lack that personal edge that made the earlier fights of Bleach so compelling and was arguably missing from his showdowns with Aizen and Ginjo. And I think Kubo knows this, and his solution is a lot of backwards writing. What I mean by this is the Thousand Year Blood War contains a lot of retroactive exposition, characters explaining how the whole story has actually been super connected. Like the
¿Cuáles son los animes de cultura que tenemos que ver sí o sí?
A ver, sacando los que vos viste en la tele, que eso no los voy a mencionar porque Dragon Ball, Death Note y todos esos los pudiste ver en la tele. Yo te digo que tenés que ver Naruto, One Piece y Bleach. No te pueden faltar. Creo que entre los tres generás una... Los tres te marcan una época del shonen.
Fate Zero.
También, pero los tres te marcan una época del shonen que tenés que verla sí o sí. Slam Dunk ya te lo pasaban en la tele. A ver, que no pasaban en la tele. Qué difícil es esto. A ver, tenés que leerte mangas como 20th Century Boys. Tenés que verte Monster. Tenés que verte Full Metal Alchemist. Tenés que verte Shingeki. Tenés que verte Bakuman. Alguna comedia romántica. Aoharu Ride. Kimi ni Todoke.
Bueno, voy a hacer un sin cultura porque One Piece creo nunca lo voy a ver.
Algún día te va a picar el bichito. Tokyo Ghoul, léete el manga de Tokyo Ghoul. Esto es una clase de anime. Acá se viene leído. Nana. Pero lo que pasa es que Nana nunca va a tener final. Y esa es una cagada. Paradise Kiss podés leerte, que es la misma autora. Es muy bueno Paradise Kiss. Pero Samurai X lo pasaban en la tele. Raymaster también. Algún manga de Osamu Tezuka. Dororo. Dororo es de Osamu Tezuka. Mirate el anime. Tengen Toppa también. Code Geass también. Pero Hunter x Hunter también lo pasaban en la tele, el original. Pero Doraemon también lo pasaban en la tele. Estoy obviando todos los que vimos en la tele, como Digimon, Pokémon, Slam Dunk. Todos esos que los pudiste ver en la tele. Un manga que no tenga anime que sea muy bueno. Mira. Paradise Kiss. Son 5 tomitos de la autora enana. Bestiarius. Son 7 tomos. Es sobre un chico que está en la época de los gladiadores. Que conoce algo que no es un dragón, pero no me acuerdo qué es lo que es. Que tiene que escapar de ahí. Y después se van abriendo side historias. Está muy bueno. Sayonara Sorcier. La historia de Vincent y Teodoro Van Gogh. Es muy bueno. Y Nijigahara Holograph de Inyo Asano. Les voy a leer de lo que trata Nijigahara Holograph. Entre los niños del pueblo se propaga un escalofriante rumor. Una criatura misteriosa acecha en el túnel que hay detrás de la escuela. Cuando el cuerpo sin vida de la madre de Ari es encontrado en la entrada del túnel, la leyenda parece confirmarse. Con el fin de apaciguar la ira de la bestia, los niños deciden ofrecerle en sacrificio a la desafortunada chica, quien parece ser la causa de la maldición. Es muy bueno. Es muy bueno. Es más. El abuelo. El abuelo. Los orígenes del abuelo.
Es curioso que las mejores cosas de la vida normalmente ocurren por casualidad. O quizás no. Tal vez sea muy probable que nuestros destinos nos guíen a encontrarnos con esas cosas que nos harán felices y permitan que pasemos momentos hermosos. Esta reflexión que estoy planteando al inicio se puede aplicar para situaciones de mayor o menor relevancia. Pero el otro, el protagonista de este video, se llama Nijigahara Holograph. ¡Ah! Guiño que...
El abuelo en sus tiempos... El abuelo Prime. Video de 1940. Disfrútenlo. Disfruten.
That Ichigo's mother
Al abuelo cuando le quedaban más años de vida.
was actually a Quincy, but the reason she couldn't defend herself against Grant Fisher is because the moment she was attacked was coincidentally also the moment that Yacht awoke from a 900-year slumber and momentarily drained all Quincy of their power, meaning in a kind of Ashton Kutcher butterfly effect kind of way, Yacht is responsible for the death of Ichigo's mother, and they lean on that plot point a lot. There's also another subplot where Yacht is actually the man who lives in Ichigo's sword for the entire series and has been secretly controlling his actions the whole time. Granted, that was kind of Aizen's deal too, but his actions during Soul Society did establish him as a master manipulator, whereas with Yacht, it feels way less justified. My problem with this stuff isn't that I think Kubo's making it up as he goes along. I don't know if he is, and I don't care if he is. A lot of really great manga authors have been open about the fact that they improvise large parts of their story, and so I really don't think it's a problem if you can do it right. But I don't think Kubo does, as the issue with this kind of retroactive exposition is it's a very cheap way to try and solve long-term story problems. And I say cheap because it's really easy to write like this. It's really easy to retroactively explain how any situation was actually the plan of some evil genius. For example, do you honestly think I actually made those completely obvious mistakes in my original video? Oh, you poor fools. I planted those inaccuracies there, knowing the video would be controversial, knowing that controversy would spread it across the internet like a virus, and knowing that 4 years later, I could just release another massively controversial Bleach video, and the fact that you've watched this far into the video means my plans worked. Your watch time will fuel YouTube's algorithm, spreading this video across the world and destroying Bleach's reputation once again.
¿Y qué tal si este muchacho era Zog? ¿Qué tal si todo este tiempo este muchacho manipuló a Zog para que donara? Lo cambia todo. Lo cambia todo. Lo cambió todo.
And I won't stop. I hope you're looking forward to the fall of Bleach 8 years later, because I'm just going to keep making videos like this until Bleach's reputation is nothing but ash and rust. See? This is why I don't think Ichigo is a well-suited protagonist of a long-term series, as the story has to constantly bend itself around him to keep him relevant, and that leads to the kind of contrived writing we just talked about. And because of that, it strains the fictional credibility of the story, making the main narrative thread difficult to believe in. But unfortunately, this arc is haunted by more old problems than just this, especially in its battle-heavy second half. One flashback segment aside, the Wonder Reich are massively underdeveloped as characters, which has the knock-on effect of draining the emotional narrative from these fights, exposing the weaker technical narratives of them, the vast majority of which end in star fingers. Again, these moments always look fucking cool, but in terms of creating a technical narrative that pulls the reader from chapter to chapter, they fail, with sales at this point continuing to fall. But the biggest blow for the 1000-Year Blood War, and maybe for Bleach in general, is how it ends. Just as the final showdown with Yacht is getting started, it was announced that the next volume of Bleach would be its last, meaning the story only had about 5 chapters to go. Fans were shocked, posting laundry lists of unanswered plot points that the remaining chapters would have to conclude. But from a storytelling perspective, Yacht is now a godlike being with the power to see and control the future. It left no room for a believable or satisfying conclusion. Instead, what happens is Uryu uses a brand new weapon to disable Yacht's godlike abilities, and Ichigo slashes him with a giant, completely unexplained surge of power. Every time I read through this, I always feel like I've missed a chapter or read something wrong. And then I reread it to discover that I haven't. And if the fight with Aizen was disappointing, this is just devastating, because there is a good story here. Yacht fighting for his desire to bring an end
Porque no hay fondos en el manga de Bleach.
Porque a Tite Kubo no le gustaba dibujar fondos. Por eso nunca vas a ver un fondo en Bleach.
Death and suffering, Ichigo fighting for the idea that it is death and suffering that give life and hope meaning. And I think that's a beautiful message, but the problem isn't with that message, it's with the storytelling that surrounds it. We get 2 epilogue chapters, and that's it. That's the end of Bleach. Which brings us back to the very start of this video. When I made that original Fall of Bleach video, I wasn't driven by a need to shit on something that was already being plenty shot on. I was driven by the disappointment of years of watching something I loved turn into something I didn't. And by any conceivable metric, you can see a lot of people felt that way, nearly half its audience. And I think it's important to acknowledge the viewpoint of those fans because to me, being a fan isn't unconditionally loving something. It's understand 4 years later, the fact that I still have problems with Bleach doesn't mean I wasn't wrong in that original video. I was. But that doesn't mean I don't still have problems with Bleach or that a lot of people didn't. And if you're a massive Bleach fan right up till the end, if you've watched this entire video disagreeing with every point I make, then I have only one thing to say to you. Thanks for watching the video. I really appreciate your willingness to hear me out on this, and I think it's cool.
Gracias, bro.